The strangest thing about that hospital wasn't the alien technology. It was the one human everyone forgot to notice. At 2 in the morning, the Interstellar Children's Medical Center felt less like a hospital and more like a quiet machine breathing in the dark. The overhead lights hummed softly, casting pale silver reflections across polished floors that stretched for what felt like miles. Outside the panoramic windows, the night sky above Orion Station glowed faintly, with distant cargo ships drifting like slow fireflies against the black. Inside, most of the corridors were empty. Doctors had finished their rounds. Visitors had gone home hours ago. The only sounds left were the steady rhythm of life support monitors and the faint whir of cleaning equipment moving across the floor. Daniel Carter pushed his mop bucket slowly down the hallway, the wheels squeaking every few feet. The scent of hospital disinfectant mixed with something sharper, almost metallic, the sterile tang of alien medicine. He paused beneath a glowing wall panel and glanced at his watch. 2:07 a.m. Another long shift nearly halfway done. Daniel wasn't a doctor, a nurse, or a technician in one of the advanced laboratories upstairs. He was the janitor, the guy who cleaned the mess after everyone else saved the day. 5 nights a week, he walked these corridors in gray coveralls with a cleaning cart and a quiet routine. Mop the floors, empty the bins, wipe down the handrails. Most people never looked twice at him. That was fine. Daniel had gotten used to being invisible. In a hospital full of miracle machines and brilliant specialists from a dozen star systems, a human janitor barely registered. Still, he took pride in doing the job right. Clean floors meant fewer infections. Order meant someone's child might heal a little easier. That was enough for him. He turned the corner into a quieter wing of the hospital where the lighting dimmed automatically to simulate nighttime. Pediatric rehabilitation. Daniel slowed his steps, careful not to let the mop bucket rattle too loudly. Kids needed sleep, no matter what planet they came from. Through a partially open door, he heard something unexpected. Not a machine, not a nurse. A soft sound. Crying. Daniel stopped. The room number glowed above the door in soft blue light. He gently pushed the door open just a few inches. Inside, the room was illuminated by the pale glow of medical equipment. A young alien girl lay in a reclining medical bed surrounded by sleek chrome devices and softly blinking monitors. Her skin shimmered faintly turquoise under the lights, almost like ocean water reflecting moonlight. Long silver hair spilled across the pillow behind her small shoulders. She couldn't have been older than 10. Her legs rested inside a mechanical support frame, an advanced rehabilitation exoskeleton designed to help damaged nerves reconnect. But the machine was powered down, silent, and the girl was crying quietly into the blanket pulled up to her chest. Daniel stood there for a moment, unsure whether to step inside or walk away. Janitors weren't supposed to interfere. That was the rule. Still, something about the way she wiped her eyes quickly, like she didn't want anyone to see, tugged at him. Slowly, he set the mop handle against the wall and stepped into the room. "Hey," he said gently, his voice low so it wouldn't echo through the monitors. "Sorry, didn't mean to scare you." The girl turned her head slightly. Her eyes, large and luminous, the color of pale gold, studied him with quiet curiosity. Daniel offered a small, awkward smile. "Name's Daniel," he said, gesturing toward the cleaning cart behind him. "I'm the night janitor." She looked at him for another moment, then glanced down at the silent machine around her legs. Daniel followed her gaze. Even without medical training, he could tell the equipment hadn't been used in a while. He'd seen enough patients in this wing to recognize the look of frustration when therapy stopped working. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck thoughtfully. "You know," he said after a moment, walking over to straighten the blanket that had slipped from the bed, "hospitals get pretty lonely at night." The girl blinked slowly. Her crying had stopped. For the first time since he entered the room, a tiny flicker of curiosity replaced the sadness in her eyes. Daniel adjusted the pillow behind her shoulders, careful and gentle. "Good news, though," he added quietly. "Night shift's got one advantage." He gave a soft grin. "We've got time." And somewhere beyond the room, hidden in the silent security network of the hospital, a camera continued watching everything. Daniel Carter had learned something about hospitals after 3 years of working the night shift. The machines were impressive, the technology looked like something out of a science fiction movie, and the doctors often spoke in words that sounded like they belonged in a university lecture hall. But when the lights dimmed and the corridors fell quiet, the truth was much simpler. Every patient was still just a person who did not want to feel alone. The little alien girl watched him carefully as he adjusted the blanket around her legs. Up close, Daniel could see the faint shimmer of turquoise along her skin and the delicate patterns that ran across her arms like ripples in shallow water. He had seen many alien species during his time at the hospital, but there was something especially gentle about her appearance. The medical bracelet around her wrist displayed her name in glowing letters. Lyra Viral. Daniel noticed the surname immediately. Even a janitor who spent most of his time pushing a mop bucket knew that name. Viral Industries, the largest biomedical corporation in the Orion sector. The company that funded half the research laboratories on the station. Daniel blinked once, surprised, then quietly pushed the thought aside. To him, she was still just a kid lying in a hospital bed at 2 in the morning. Lyra, he said softly, reading the bracelet so his pronunciation would be correct. Her luminous golden eyes widened slightly. Did I say it right? Daniel asked. The girl nodded slowly. Her voice, when it came, was quiet and musical. Yes. It was the first word she had spoken since he entered the room. Daniel smiled. Good. I am not very good with alien languages. He pulled a small chair closer to the bedside and sat down with the casual ease of someone who had spent countless nights talking to patients when nurses were too busy to linger. The rehabilitation frame around Lyra's legs looked complicated, a web of sleek metal supports and neural connectors. Daniel had seen versions of these machines before. They were supposed to help patients relearn how to stand and walk after serious injuries. Tonight, however, the entire system was powered down. Long day, Daniel asked gently. Lyra looked toward the silent machine around her legs and then back to him. She nodded once. Daniel understood that nod. He had seen it from adults too, the quiet exhaustion that came when people were tired of hearing hopeful words that never seemed to change anything. He leaned back in the chair and folded his arms. Comfortably. When I was a kid, he said, my mom used to say hospitals at night are like libraries. Lyra tilted her head slightly. Libraries. Quiet places where stories happen, Daniel explained. You just have to listen for them. The girl watched him, curiosity slowly replacing the sadness in her eyes. Daniel reached into the pocket of his coveralls and pulled out a small handheld tablet. The screen flickered on with a soft glow. I bring this on my shifts, he said. Helps pass the time while the floor's dry. He scrolled through the library app and paused. You ever heard of Earth fairy tales? Lyra shook her head gently. Daniel nodded as if that was the most normal thing in the universe. Well then, he said, settling deeper into the chair. That seems like a problem we should fix. He began reading in a calm, steady voice. The story was simple, about a young explorer who traveled through forests and mountains searching for something he thought was impossible to find. Lyra listened quietly, her golden eyes reflecting the soft light from the tablet screen. Outside the room, the corridor remained silent except for the distant hum of hospital systems. Minutes passed. Then something small but important happened. The corners of Lyra's mouth lifted slightly. It was not a big smile. It was the kind of fragile smile that appears when someone forgets their pain for just a moment. Daniel noticed it immediately. He did not say anything about it. He simply turned the page and kept reading. Far above the hospital floors, in a private executive suite lined with holographic displays, a tall woman with deep turquoise skin stood silently before a security monitor. Lady Soraya Viral had originally opened the camera feed to check on her daughter's medical condition. Instead, she found herself watching something unexpected. A human janitor sitting beside Lyra's bed. Reading her a story, Soraya said nothing. She simply continued watching. The next night the hospital sounded exactly the same. Air filtration units hummed softly through the ceiling vents. Distant elevators whispered open and closed somewhere down the corridor, and the polished floors reflected the steady glow of overhead lights like quiet water. Daniel Carter pushed his cleaning cart through the pediatric wing with the familiar rhythm he had learned over hundreds of shifts. The wheels rolled, the mop swayed, and the scent of disinfectant followed behind him like a faint cloud. Most nights passed this way. Quiet work. Quiet halls, quiet thoughts. But tonight his steps slowed before he even reached the door. Room 214. The same room where a turquoise-skinned girl with silver hair had listened to her first Earth fairy tale the night before. Daniel glanced at the small schedule display mounted beside the door. Rehabilitation session completed earlier that afternoon. Status unchanged. He had seen that phrase on many patient charts. Status unchanged. Sometimes it felt like the coldest sentence in the English language. Daniel pushed the door open gently. Lyra Viral was awake again. The dim lights of the room reflected softly across the chrome frame surrounding her legs. The rehabilitation exoskeleton looked even more complicated tonight. A delicate structure of joints and sensors designed to respond to neural signals that were supposed to travel from brain to muscle. Daniel had overheard enough conversations from technicians to understand the basic idea. When the nerves healed, the machine would help guide the body to remember how to stand again. At least that was the theory. Lyra looked toward the door as he entered, and the moment she saw him, her golden eyes brightened slightly. Daniel noticed the change immediately. "Well now," he said with a gentle grin, parking his cleaning cart near the wall. "Looks like somebody stayed up past bedtime." Lyra's voice was quiet but clearer than the night before. "I waited." Daniel paused for half a second, surprised by the simple honesty of the answer. He pulled the same chair closer to her bedside and sat down again. "Waiting for the janitor is a pretty strange hobby," he said lightly. Lyra tilted her head. "You read stories." Daniel reached into the pocket of his gray coveralls and pulled out the tablet again. "That is true," he admitted. "And tonight we continue the adventure." But before he started reading, his eyes drifted again to the mechanical frame around her legs. The system lights were dim, indicating standby mode. The hospital had some of the most advanced rehabilitation technology in the Orion sector. Yet the machine looked like it had not been adjusted in days. Daniel leaned forward slightly, studying the alignment of the support joints. Years ago, before life had taken a few unexpected turns, he had spent time working maintenance on industrial robotics back on Earth. The machines were different, but the logic behind mechanical balance was always the same. A hinge moved. A motor assisted. Weight shifted. The frame around Lyra's knees looked off. Not broken, just slightly misaligned. Daniel tapped the edge of the metal brace thoughtfully with one finger. "Does this thing feel uncomfortable?" he asked gently. Lyra nodded slowly. "It pulls." Daniel leaned back again and rubbed his chin. "That should not happen." He looked at the control panel mounted beside the bed. Rows of diagnostic lights glowed quietly. Hospital staff probably trusted the system to calibrate itself automatically. Machines were supposed to know what they were doing. But machines sometimes missed the small details humans noticed. Daniel stood up and walked around the frame slowly, examining the joint connectors the same way a mechanic studies an engine. He did not touch anything yet. He was only looking. "You know," he said after a moment, speaking casually so the room would not feel tense. "On Earth we have an old saying about complicated machines." Lyra watched him with curious attention. "What saying?" she asked. Daniel smiled slightly. "If something does not work the way it should," he said, "sometimes the smartest thing to do is step back and look at it like it is brand new." Across the hospital station, far above the quiet patient rooms, Lady Soraya Viral stood once again before the security display wall in her private office. The screen showed a single image. A human janitor slowly walking around the rehabilitation frame surrounding her daughter's legs. Soraya narrowed her eyes slightly, studying every movement. She had funded the development of medical technologies that spanned 3-star systems. Yet tonight she was watching a man with a mop bucket quietly inspect the most advanced rehabilitation machine her company had ever built. Daniel stood quietly beside the rehabilitation frame for several seconds, studying the machine the same way a careful mechanic studies an engine that does not quite sound right. The room was silent except for the soft hum of the hospital systems and the faint whisper of air circulating through the vents above them. Lyra watched him with curious golden eyes, her small hands folded together on top of the blanket. She did not speak. She simply waited. Daniel finally leaned closer to one of the joints near her knee and squinted slightly. "Well," he murmured to himself, "that looks a little strange." Lyra tilted her head. "Strange." Daniel glanced back at her and smiled gently, so she would not worry. "Maybe strange is not the right word," he said. "Let us say interesting." He crouched beside the frame, careful not to bump any of the delicate sensors attached along the metal supports. The exoskeleton was beautifully engineered. Thin silver struts ran along the sides of her legs, each one connected by smooth mechanical hinges designed to move with perfect balance. Small indicator lights blinked in calm blue patterns along the support bars. To most people it probably looked flawless. But Daniel noticed something small. One of the alignment braces near the hip joint was angled just a fraction of an inch differently than the other side. Not enough to trigger an alarm. Not enough for an automated calibration system to notice. But enough that the machine might pull instead of support. Daniel leaned back on his heels and crossed his arms thoughtfully. "Did the doctors adjust this today?" he asked. Lyra shook her head. "Yesterday." Daniel nodded slowly. "That makes sense." Machines, he had learned, often drifted a little after a day of use. Not because they were badly designed, just because real bodies were not perfectly symmetrical. He reached out and gently tapped one of the small locking brackets with the tip of his finger. The metal gave the faintest click. Lyra watched every movement. "Are you fixing it?" she asked quietly. Daniel chuckled softly. "I am not fixing anything yet," he said. "Right now I am only looking." He stood up again and walked slowly around the bed, studying the other side of the frame. The alignment difference was clearer from this angle. One hinge had been calibrated using the standard template for viral biomechanical therapy systems. That template probably worked perfectly for 90% of patients. But Lyra was a child. Her posture was different. Her balance was different. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck thoughtfully. "Sometimes," he said, speaking more to the room than to her, "machines are built by people who assume everything is perfectly straight." Lyra blinked. "Is that bad?" Daniel smiled. "Not bad. Just optimistic." He walked to the control panel mounted beside the bed and studied the calibration menu glowing on the screen. The interface displayed dozens of diagnostic readouts in neat rows of alien engineering symbols mixed with English text. The system allowed manual adjustments, but only trained technicians were supposed to access them. Daniel stared at the controls for a moment, weighing the decision carefully. Then he glanced back at Lyra. The girl was watching him with quiet hope. Daniel sighed softly and shook his head with a small, amused smile. "You know something?" he said. "When I started this job, nobody told me I might end up arguing with a billion-credit medical machine." Lyra's lips twitched with the beginning of a smile. Daniel gently placed one hand on the metal brace near her knee, not changing anything yet, only testing the balance of the joint. The support frame shifted slightly under the weight of his hand. The hinge moved with a soft mechanical whisper. He nodded slowly. "Yep," he murmured. "I thought so." He looked at Lyra again. "Tell me something," he said kindly. "When you try to stand, does it feel like the machine is pulling you sideways?" Lyra's eyes widened in surprise. "Yes." Daniel gave a small satisfied nod. "That means the machine is doing half the job," he said. "The other half just needs a little help." Far above the pediatric wing, Lady Soraya Viral stood perfectly still in front of the glowing security display. Her expression, normally calm and controlled, had changed slightly. Because the human janitor had just described a flaw that none of the hospital's engineers had noticed. Daniel kept one hand resting lightly on the metal brace while the other hovered near the control panel. The room remained quiet except for the gentle rhythm of hospital equipment humming through the walls. Lyra watched him with careful attention, the fragile hope in her golden eyes growing a little brighter. Daniel studied the hinge again, turning it just enough to feel the tension in the joint. It was subtle, but the difference was there. The brace on the left side moved freely while the one on the right carried slightly more pressure than it should. "All right," Daniel said softly, mostly to himself. "Let us see what you are trying to do." He stepped over to the control panel and examined the settings glowing on the screen. Lines of diagnostic data scrolled slowly across the display. Muscle response calibration, neural response delay, balance assist threshold. The numbers were precise, calculated down to tiny fractions of a degree. To the engineers who designed the system, those numbers probably looked perfect. But Daniel knew something about machines that worked with real bodies. Perfect numbers on a screen did not always match the messy reality of living movement. He leaned closer to the display and tapped a single option labeled Manual Alignment Assist. The interface asked for confirmation. Daniel paused for a moment. Technically, he was not supposed to do this. The hospital had entire departments dedicated to this equipment. But he looked over at Lyra again, sitting patiently inside a machine that was supposed to help her stand, yet only seemed to pull her sideways. Daniel exhaled slowly. "Well," he said quietly, Sometimes you have to trust common sense. He pressed the confirmation icon. The frame around Lyra's legs emitted a soft mechanical tone as the system unlocked its adjustment mode. Tiny indicator lights shifted from blue to pale green. Daniel walked back to the brace and gently adjusted the alignment bracket near her hip by less than half an inch. The movement was almost invisible, but he could feel the balance change immediately. The joint settled into a more natural angle. Daniel stepped back and looked at the entire frame again, his head tilted slightly. "That is better," he murmured. Lyra watched him carefully. "Will it work?" Daniel rested his hands on his hips and gave a small shrug. "Machines are funny things," he said. "Sometimes they just need someone to remind them what they are supposed to do." He reached over and tapped the main control button on the side of the bed. The rehabilitation frame hummed quietly as the support motors activated. The slender mechanical joints straightened along Lyra's legs with slow, careful precision. Daniel moved closer again, standing beside her so she would feel steady. "All right," he said gently. "Let us try something simple." Lyra swallowed and nodded. Daniel lowered the bed slightly until her feet touched the floor. The machine adjusted automatically, supporting part of her weight through the frame. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Daniel noticed something different. The brace was no longer pulling her sideways. The frame held steady, balanced perfectly between both legs. Lyra looked down in surprise. "It feels different," she whispered. Daniel smiled. "Different can be good." He extended one hand in front of her. "Do not rush," he said calmly. "Just shift your weight a little. Let the machine help." Lyra took a slow breath. Then she pressed gently against the frame. The motors responded with a soft mechanical whisper, guiding her posture upright. For the first time since Daniel had met her, her shoulders lifted slightly as the machine supported her evenly. It was only a small change, but Daniel could see it immediately. Her balance had improved. Across the hospital complex, Lady Soraya Viral leaned closer to the security monitor without realizing she had moved. On the screen, her daughter was sitting taller than she had in weeks, and the only person standing beside her was a human janitor in gray coveralls. Lyra's hands tightened slightly around the edge of the bed as the rehabilitation frame supported more of her weight. The motors inside the slender metal structure hummed softly, adjusting microbalances in real time. Daniel stood close beside her, not touching her yet, but ready if she needed support. The room felt strangely quiet, as if even the hospital machines were waiting to see what would happen next. Lyra looked down at her legs with wide golden eyes. The frame had lifted her higher than she had expected. Her feet now rested flat against the polished floor, supported by the mechanical braces running along her calves and knees. For a moment she simply stayed there, breathing slowly, feeling the unfamiliar balance. "It does not pull anymore," she whispered. Daniel nodded calmly. "That is a good sign." He kept his voice steady and relaxed, the way someone speaks when they do not want excitement to create pressure. "The machine is finally working with you instead of against you." Lyra took another careful breath. The small sensors along the frame flickered green as the system detected her shifting posture. Daniel noticed the numbers updating on the side display. Muscle response, minimal but present. Balance assist, stable. The system had not shown numbers like that in days. Daniel crouched slightly so he could see her face. "All right," he said gently. "Right now you are doing the most important part." Lyra blinked. "Standing." Daniel smiled. "Trusting yourself." She looked uncertain but determined. Slowly, she shifted a little more weight through the frame. The motors responded instantly, redistributing support so the pressure along her legs remained even. The brace joints moved with a smooth whisper. Lyra gasped quietly, not from pain, but from surprise. "It feels lighter," she said. Daniel chuckled softly. "Machines like this are supposed to do the heavy lifting." He straightened and held one hand out in front of her, palm open, offering balance without grabbing. "Do not rush," he continued. "Just try to move your weight forward a little, like you are reaching for something." Lyra stared at his hand for a moment, then focused carefully. The rehabilitation frame adjusted again, tilting forward just enough to guide her posture. Her shoulders leaned slightly toward Daniel. One foot pressed more firmly against the floor. The machine compensated instantly. For the first time since entering the hospital weeks earlier, the system's balance sensors registered a coordinated shift. Lyra inhaled sharply. "Did I do that?" Daniel nodded with a calm confidence that felt larger than the moment itself. "Yes, you did." The girl's lips trembled slightly as the realization settled in. She was not walking yet, not even close. But something important had changed. The machine was no longer fighting her body. It was helping. Daniel glanced again at the alignment brace he had adjusted earlier. Sometimes the biggest problems came from the smallest misalignments. You see, he said quietly, standing is not one big step. It is a lot of small ones. Lyra looked at him again, hope flickering in her golden eyes like the first spark of sunrise. Can I try again? Daniel gave a gentle nod. Of course. She shifted her balance one more time. The frame supported her smoothly, the motors working in quiet harmony with her movement. It lasted only a few seconds before her muscles grew tired and the system carefully lowered her back onto the bed. But when Lyra settled against the pillow again, her breathing was different. Her eyes were brighter. Daniel stepped back and folded his arms with a satisfied expression. That, he said softly, is what progress looks like. Several floors above the pediatric wing, Lady Soraya Viral remained motionless in front of the security display. The room around her was silent except for the faint hum of the station's energy grid. On the monitor, the replay loop showed the moment again and again. Her daughter shifting forward, standing taller, for the first time in weeks. And beside her, the man responsible for the change was still wearing a janitor's uniform and holding a cleaning rag in his back pocket. The room slowly returned to quiet after the machine powered down, and the rehabilitation frame eased Lyra gently back onto the bed. The motors settled into standby with a faint electronic sigh, and the soft green indicator lights shifted back to calm blue. Daniel remained beside the bed for a moment, watching the readouts on the side panel. The numbers were still small, still far from what doctors would call recovery, but they were different. For the first time since the system had been installed, the machine had recorded a successful balance shift initiated by Lyra herself. Daniel nodded quietly to himself. That is a start, he said. Lyra lay against the pillow, breathing a little faster from the effort, but she was smiling now. It was not the fragile smile from the night before. This one carried something stronger. Hope mixed with disbelief. I stood, she whispered, almost as if she was testing the words out loud. Daniel leaned against the rail at the foot of the bed and folded his arms comfortably. You did more than that, he said. You told the machine how to work with you. Lyra looked toward the rehabilitation frame again. Will the doctors see it? Daniel glanced at the system logs glowing softly on the screen. They will, he answered. Machines record everything. He paused for a moment, then added with a small grin. They might just wonder who helped the machine remember how to behave. Lyra giggled quietly. The sound echoed softly through the otherwise silent room. For a hospital that had felt so heavy with disappointment the past few weeks, that small laugh seemed to brighten the air. Daniel reached for the blanket and gently pulled it back over her legs. That is enough work for one night, he said kindly. Even explorers have to rest. Lyra's golden eyes followed him as he stepped back toward his cleaning cart. Will you come back tomorrow? She asked. Daniel pretended to think about it for a second, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. Well, he said slowly, these floors do not mop themselves. Lyra smiled again, satisfied with the answer. Daniel picked up his mop handle and rolled the cart toward the door. Before leaving, he looked back once more. The rehabilitation frame stood quietly beside the bed, its polished metal reflecting the dim hospital lights. Just a few hours earlier it had been fighting against the girl inside it. Now it waited patiently for the next attempt. Sleep well, Lyra, Daniel said softly. Tomorrow we try again. He turned off the room's brighter lights and stepped into the hallway. The door closed behind him with a gentle hiss. The corridor outside was as empty as ever, stretching long and silent under rows of soft ceiling lamps. Daniel resumed his slow routine, pushing the mop bucket forward while the wheels squeaked faintly against the polished floor. To anyone passing by, he looked exactly the same as always. Just a janitor doing his job during the quietest hours of the night. Several floors above the pediatric wing, however, the atmosphere was very different. Lady Soraya Viral stood in the center of her private office, surrounded by a wall of floating holographic displays. One screen replayed the footage from Lyra's room again and again. Each time the moment appeared, Soraya watched closely. The adjustment of the brace. The shift in balance. Her daughter leaning forward. Standing taller. She had hired some of the finest biomedical engineers in 3-star systems to design that rehabilitation technology. Yet none of them had solved the problem that a human janitor had noticed within minutes. Soraya slowly folded her hands behind her back, her turquoise skin reflecting the soft glow of the monitors. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was calm but filled with quiet authority. Identify the human employee in that room. She instructed the station's artificial intelligence system. The answer appeared instantly on the nearest display. Daniel Carter. Maintenance staff. Night sanitation crew. Soraya studied the name thoughtfully. Then she gave a single quiet order. Prepare a meeting. The next evening, the hospital corridors were busier than usual during the early hours. But by the time Daniel Carter's night shift began, the building had settled again into its familiar quiet rhythm. The overhead lights dimmed automatically to nighttime levels. The nurses moved more slowly between rooms, and the distant sounds of medical equipment blended into a soft mechanical chorus that echoed gently through the halls. Daniel pushed his cleaning cart along the polished floor exactly as he had every night before, the wheels rolling with their usual squeak while the scent of disinfectant followed behind him. To anyone passing through the corridor, nothing about the scene looked unusual. A human janitor working the late shift was hardly worth noticing in a hospital that served dozens of alien species every day. Daniel reached the pediatric rehabilitation wing and glanced toward room 214 almost automatically. He had told himself he would not interfere again. The adjustment he made the night before had been small, and technically he was not supposed to touch the equipment at all. But the memory of Lyra standing, even for a moment, lingered in his thoughts. He slowed his steps and pushed the door open gently. Lyra was already awake. The dim light of the room reflected softly across the metal frames surrounding her legs, and the moment she saw Daniel, her expression brightened with excitement. "You came back," she said. Daniel gave a small smile and leaned the mop against the wall. "A promise is a promise," he replied. He walked closer and glanced at the rehabilitation system display beside the bed. The machine had recorded last night's successful balance shift exactly as he expected. The data log showed it clearly. For a brief moment, the system had achieved stable alignment. Lyra watched him with eager curiosity. "Can we try again?" she asked. Daniel chuckled softly. "Slow down there, explorer," he said kindly. "Even big discoveries need practice." He checked the brace alignment once more, confirming the adjustment had remained in place. Then he tapped the control panel and activated the system again. The frame responded with the same quiet mechanical hum as before, lifting carefully to support her legs. Daniel stepped beside her, ready to steady her balance if necessary. "All right," he said calmly. "Just like yesterday." Small movement. Lyra focused, her golden eyes narrowing with determination as she shifted her weight forward. The motors adjusted instantly, guiding her posture. The machine stabilized, and once again she rose slightly higher than she had before. Daniel nodded approvingly. "That is it," he said. "Let the machine help." Lyra smiled with concentration as she maintained the balance for several seconds. The sensors blinked green along the frame. The progress was small, but real. Then a voice spoke from the doorway. "So this is where the miracle is happening." Daniel turned immediately. Standing in the doorway was a tall woman whose presence seemed to change the entire atmosphere of the room. Her turquoise skin reflected the soft hospital lights with a natural elegance, and her silver hair was tied back in a simple but graceful style. Even without the formal attire of a corporate leader, her posture carried unmistakable authority. Daniel recognized the face instantly. Lady Soraya Viral, founder of Viral Industries, one of the most powerful figures in the Orion sector. For a moment, Daniel simply blinked in surprise. Soraya stepped slowly into the room, her gaze moving from the rehabilitation frame to her daughter standing within it. The expression in her eyes softened in a way Daniel had not expected from someone with such a reputation. "Lyra," she said gently. The girl turned with excitement. "Mother." Soraya watched her daughter standing supported by the machine, then looked toward Daniel. "I reviewed the system recordings from last night," she said calmly. "And I believe I owe you a conversation." Daniel rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. "Ma'am, I was just helping a little." Soraya studied him for a long moment, then glanced back at the machine surrounding her daughter's legs. "Sometimes," she said thoughtfully, "a little help is exactly what the most advanced technology needs." The room remained quiet for several seconds after Lady Soraya Viral spoke. The soft hum of the rehabilitation frame continued as Lyra balanced carefully within the support system, her small hands steady against the frame rails. Daniel Carter stood beside her, unsure where to look for a moment. Being noticed by hospital staff was rare. Being noticed by one of the most powerful figures in three-star systems was something entirely different. Soraya stepped further into the room, her calm presence filling the space without effort. She moved slowly toward the bed, her eyes focused entirely on her daughter. Lyra looked up at her mother with excitement shining in her golden eyes. "Mother!" "I stood again," she said proudly. Soraya's expression softened in a way that few people had ever seen in public. She reached forward and gently placed a hand on Lyra's shoulder. "Yes," she said quietly. "I saw." Her gaze then shifted toward the rehabilitation frame, studying the alignment brackets Daniel had adjusted. The change was small, but it was obvious to anyone who understood engineering. Soraya turned her attention back to Daniel. "Our medical division spent months refining this system," she said calmly. "Dozens of specialists worked on its calibration." Daniel shifted his weight slightly, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. "Machines can be tricky," he replied modestly. "Sometimes they just need a small adjustment." Soraya studied him for a long moment, then gave a faint smile. "A small adjustment," she repeated thoughtfully. She turned back toward the control panel and reviewed the system logs again. The data showed the moment when the alignment changed, the exact moment when Lyra's balance finally stabilized. The system had performed perfectly after that point. The only difference was the human who had noticed the flaw. Soraya stepped back from the console and folded her hands behind her back. "Mr. Carter," she said, "do you know how many engineers Viral Industries employs?" Daniel shook his head slightly. "No, ma'am." "Over 40,000, Soraya replied calmly. "And yet none of them corrected this problem." Daniel glanced at the frame around Lyra's legs and shrugged gently. "Sometimes the person who builds the machine forgets to ask the person who uses it." Lyra giggled softly from the bed. Soraya looked back at her daughter, then slowly nodded as if something had just become clear. She walked toward the door, pausing beside Daniel before speaking again. "Tomorrow morning," she said, "the hospital engineering team will review the rehabilitation system using the adjustments you made tonight." Daniel blinked in surprise. "Ma'am, I did not mean to interfere with." Soraya raised a hand gently, stopping him. "You did not interfere," she said. "You helped." She turned toward Lyra once more, watching her daughter sitting taller in the machine than she had in weeks. The quiet pride in Soraya's voice was impossible to miss when she spoke again. "My daughter has spent many nights believing progress was impossible," she said softly. "Tonight she stood because someone cared enough to look closer." Daniel rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. "She did the hard part," he said. Soraya gave a slight nod. "Perhaps," she replied. "But sometimes the universe moves forward because one person refuses to ignore a small problem." She then stepped toward the doorway and looked back one final time. "Mr. Carter," she said calmly, "your shift tomorrow night will be different." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Different how?" Soraya allowed herself a faint, knowing smile. "Because beginning tomorrow," she said, "you will no longer be the only person in this hospital who knows how valuable your perspective truly is." She left the room quietly after that. Daniel stood there for a moment beside the bed, still holding the mop handle in one hand while the rehabilitation machine hummed softly beside Lyra. The girl looked up at him with excitement. "Does that mean you are in trouble?" Daniel thought about it for a second, then smiled. "I think," he said gently, "it means tomorrow might be interesting." And in the quiet glow of the hospital room, the machine beside Lyra waited patiently for the next small step forward.